June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. In the pre-dawn darkness of D-Day, American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne descended into the hedgerows behind Utah Beach. Their mission was to secure causeway exits, to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches where the largest amphibious invasion in history was unfolding. In the chaos of the drop, scattered across miles of Norman countryside, these soldiers expected to encounter German Wehrmacht units, perhaps SS troops, perhaps remnants of the divisions that had been garrisoning the Atlantic Wall. What they did not expect, as the sun rose over the blood-soaked beaches, was to capture soldiers wearing German field gray uniforms who spoke neither German nor French nor any European language the Americans could identify. Soldiers whose faces, whose features, seemed impossible in this landscape. Asian men, thousands of miles from Asia, fighting in Hitler's army on the coast of France. The Americans, many of them teenagers themselves who had never left their home states before the war, stared at these prisoners with incomprehension. Who were these men? How had they come to be here? And on whose side were they really fighting? The answer to those questions would reveal one of the strangest and most tragic odysseys of the Second World War. A journey that began not in Europe, but on the frozen border between Korea and Manchuria, that passed through 3 different armies, 3 different ideologies, 3 different wars within the larger war. A journey that illuminated what happened to individual human beings caught in the machinery of empires, when the choice was never between fighting and not fighting, but only about which uniform you would die in. This is the story of how 5,000 Korean men came to wear German uniforms on D-Day. Not volunteers, not collaborators in any meaningful sense, but conscripts forced to switch sides 3 times, each switch promising survival, each switch delivering only more war. And the story begins in 1938, not in Europe, but in Korea under Japanese occupation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Korea had ceased to exist as an independent nation in 1910, when Japan formally annexed the peninsula, transforming it into a colony. For nearly 30 years, Koreans had lived under Japanese rule, their language suppressed in schools, their names forced into Japanese forms, their resources extracted to feed Japan's growing empire. By 1938, as Japan's war with China expanded, the colonial authorities faced a problem. The Imperial Japanese Army needed manpower. Millions of men to hold the vast territories Japan had conquered, to push deeper into China, to prepare for the conflicts Japanese strategists knew were coming. The solution, implemented through a series of colonial decrees, was conscription. Korean men would be drafted into Japanese service. Not into combat units initially, the Japanese military did not trust colonial subjects with weapons, but into labor battalions, construction crews, supply units, the human machinery needed to support an army in the field. By 1939, thousands of Korean men were being shipped to Manchuria, to the puppet state of Manchukuo that Japan had created in northeastern China to build fortifications along the border with the Soviet Union. Yang Kyungjong was 19 years old when he received his conscription notice in the spring of 1938. He lived in a farming village in what had been North Pyongan province, in what would one day be North Korea, but was then simply the northern part of occupied Korea. His family grew rice. He had 3 years of colonial schooling, enough to read Japanese characters, enough to understand the orders that would shape the rest of his life. The notice gave him 2 weeks to report to a collection center in Pyongyang. There was no option to refuse. Refusal meant imprisonment for the man, punishment for his family. Men who tried to flee were hunted down by colonial police. Yang Kyungjong, along with 200 other young men from his district, boarded a train that carried them north across the border into Manchuria, into a landscape that would become familiar through years of war. Flat plains, harsh winters, the kind of cold that killed men who were unprepared for it. They were issued thin cotton uniforms, assigned to Labor Battalion No. 6 of the Guangdong Army, the Japanese force occupying Manchuria, and set to work building defensive positions along the Soviet border. The work was brutal, digging trenches in frozen ground, hauling logs for bunkers, 12-hour days and temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero. The Japanese engineers who supervised them were not intentionally cruel, not by the standards of the Imperial Army, but they were indifferent to Korean suffering. Labor battalion casualties were not counted the same way combat casualties were. If men died of exposure, of malnutrition, of the dysentery that swept through poorly supplied camps, these deaths appeared in no official records that mattered. The labor battalions existed to spare Japanese soldiers from this work. If Koreans died doing it, more could be conscripted. Yang survived the winter of 1938 through 1939 and the one after that. He learned Russian phrases from the occasional Soviet prisoners his unit was ordered to help guard. He learned the Japanese military's obsessive attention to hierarchy, to ritual, to the unquestioned obedience that was expected from everyone below you and demanded from everyone above you. He learned that survival in this system meant making yourself useful, learning skills that were valued, staying healthy enough to work, but not so healthy that you were transferred to a more dangerous assignment. What Yang did not know, what none of the Korean laborers knew in any detail, was that the Japanese and Soviets were already fighting. Not a declared war, but a series of border conflicts that escalated through 1939. Skirmishes that became battles, that became something approaching conventional warfare. In May of that year, Mongolian cavalry backed by Soviet tanks crossed the border into Manchu Kuo at a place called Kaukon-Gol. The Japanese response was swift and massive. Infantry divisions, artillery, air support. The Battle of Kaukon-Gol would rage for months, and while it remained obscure to the world, overshadowed by the German invasion of Poland that would begin the European War, it was the largest military conflict in the world at that moment. It was also Japan's first major military defeat in 40 years. Soviet armor and artillery, commanded by a then unknown general named Georgy Zhukov, destroyed 2 Japanese divisions, killed 18,000 Japanese soldiers, and taught the Imperial Army a lesson about Soviet military capability that would shape Japanese strategy for the rest of the war. The Japanese would never attack the Soviet Union again. They would turn south instead, toward the oil and rubber of Southeast Asia, toward Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. But in August of 1939, as the Battle of Kaukon-Gol reached its climax, Yang Kyungjong and thousands of other Korean laborers found themselves not digging fortifications far from combat, but pressed into service carrying supplies to the front, helping to evacuate Japanese wounded, exposed to Soviet artillery fire and aerial bombardment. The distinction between labor units and combat units collapsed in the chaos of battle. Men carrying ammunition to forward positions were just as likely to die as men firing rifles from them. Yang's battalion lost 1/3 of its strength in 3 weeks. Not from direct combat. They were rarely armed, but from artillery, from bombing, from simply being in the wrong place when Soviet tanks broke through Japanese lines. When the ceasefire came in September 1939, when both sides pulled back and established a new border, Yang had learned something about war that the Japanese officers who commanded him already knew. The designation of your unit mattered less than your location. Non-combatant was a category that existed on paper that meant nothing when shells were falling. And he had learned something else, that there were armies in the world more powerful than Japan's, armies with tanks in numbers the Japanese could not match, with artillery that made Japanese guns seem like toys. He had seen what modern combined arms warfare looked like when the other side possessed both the equipment and the doctrine to wage it. This knowledge would serve him well in the years ahead, though not in any way he might have chosen. The labor battalions were pulled back from the Soviet border after Kaukon-Gol, reassigned to northern Manchuria, set to work on new projects, building railways, constructing barracks for the expanded Guangdong Army. The work remained brutal, but the immediate threat of combat receded. For 2 years, Yang's existence settled into a grim routine. 16-hour workdays in summer. Shorter days in winter when frostbite made outdoor labor too dangerous even by the Guangdong Army standards. Rice rations that kept men just above starvation. Occasional letters from home, censored by Japanese military police, telling Yang that his family was enduring that his younger brother had also been conscripted, that his sister had been sent to work in a textile factory in southern Korea. Then came June of 1941, and everything changed. Not because of anything Japan did, but because of what happened thousands of miles to the west. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces crashed across the Soviet border from Poland and Romania and Finland. The largest invasion in human history. The Wehrmacht drove east, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, advancing in a matter of weeks farther than Napoleon had reached in months. The news reached Manchuria through Japanese military channels. For the officers of the Guangdong Army, this was a moment of profound strategic possibility. If Germany destroyed the Soviet Union, if the Red Army collapsed, then Manchuria's northern border would be secure. Japan could move south without fear of Soviet intervention. The war planners in Tokyo who were designing the conquest of Southeast Asia could proceed without maintaining massive forces to guard against Siberia. But for the Soviet Union, the German invasion was an immediate catastrophe of unimaginable scale. In 3 months, the Wehrmacht captured 3 million Soviet soldiers. Entire field armies ceased to exist. The Germans reached the outskirts of Leningrad, of Moscow. By September 1941, neutral observers, including American military attachés, were reporting that the Soviet Union might collapse before winter. Joseph Stalin, desperate for men, for any men who could hold a rifle, ordered mobilization on a scale unprecedented even by Soviet standards. 15 million men would eventually serve in the Red Army during the war. But in the crisis of 1941, the Soviet Union needed soldiers immediately, and it found them in the most unlikely places, including among the prisoners from Kochan Gol, including among populations in the Soviet Far East whose loyalty Stalin doubted, and including, though this would take longer, among the laborers the Japanese worked to death in Manchuria. Because the border between Manchukuo and the Soviet Union was not a wall. It was hundreds of miles of forests and rivers and mountains. And Korean laborers worked beyond endurance, facing death from malnutrition or exposure, sometimes fled. They crossed into Soviet territory, were captured by border guards, and faced a choice: prison in the Soviet gulags or service in the Red Army. Yang Kyung-jong made this choice in October of 1941. His labor battalion had been transferred to a logging camp in the forests near the Amur River. The work was killing men at a rate that shocked even the Japanese overseers. Trees felled by hand with inadequate tools, logs hauled by men rather than horses, 16-hour shifts in cold rain that turned to snow as October became November. Men were collapsing, dying of exhaustion in their bunks. The Japanese response was to adjust ration calculations, to reduce food for men who could not meet quotas. Yang, weighing perhaps 100 pounds, knew he would not survive the winter. Neither would most of his battalion. So one night in late October, along with 3 other men from his village, he walked away from the camp. They moved north toward the border, following the Amur River upstream. They had no food beyond a few handfuls of rice they had saved. No warm clothing. No real plan beyond crossing the border and hoping Soviet authorities would not simply shoot them as Japanese agents. They nearly froze in the first 3 days. The night temperatures were already dropping below zero. They ate bark, roots, anything they could find. One man died on the 4th day, simply sat down and could not rise again. The other 3 kept moving. On the 6th day, they encountered a Soviet border patrol. Mongolian troops on horseback who surrounded them with rifles raised, who shouted at them in Russian. Yang raised his hands. He spoke the few Russian words he had learned. Na Japanets, not Japanese. Koreyski, Korean. The patrol took them to a border post where a Soviet political officer, a commissar, interviewed them through a translator who spoke some Japanese. Yang explained his situation. Conscripted by Japan. Forced into labor. Escaped. The commissar asked why they should not be sent to a prison camp, treated as enemy nationals. Yang's answer: according to the translator's notes that somehow survived in Soviet archives, was simple. We are not Japanese. We are Korean. Korea is occupied. Japan is your enemy. Let us fight them. The Commissar considered this. The Soviet Union in October 1941 needed every man who could hold a rifle. The Germans were 40 miles from Moscow. Leningrad was under siege. Entire armies had been destroyed. Stalin had issued orders that anyone who could fight would fight. The Commissar made his decision. The 3 Korean escapees were sent to a Red Army processing center, given uniforms, assigned to a unit forming in eastern Siberia, and within 6 weeks found themselves on trains heading west toward the front. Yang Kyungjong, who had served in the Japanese army against his will, was now serving in the Soviet army, still against his will, but with one crucial difference. In the Red Army, he had been given a rifle. For the first time since his conscription 3 years earlier, he was armed, he was expected to fight, and the enemy he would face was, at least initially, not Russian or American or British, but potentially Japanese, the nation that had colonized his homeland. The irony of this situation was not lost on Yang or the other Korean soldiers who found themselves in Red Army uniforms. Soviet authorities did not entirely trust them. They were organized into separate Korean battalions, kept under close political supervision, assigned commissars who watched for signs of defection. But they were given the same training as other Soviet recruits, the same weapons, and, eventually, the same orders to march toward the sound of the guns. Yang's unit, the 384th Rifle Division, completed training in December 1941 and was sent west in January of 1942. The train journey took 3 weeks, crossing the entire width of Asia, from the forests of the Soviet Far East to the steppes of Ukraine. Yang had never seen such distances, such landscapes. For days, the train rolled through snow-covered plains, through cities whose names meant nothing to him, through a country mobilizing for total war. Factories visible from the train windows. Columns of troops marching alongside the tracks. Women digging anti-tank ditches in frozen ground. The war Yang entered in February 1942 was not the war of rapid German advances and Soviet collapse. The Wehrmacht had been stopped before Moscow in December. The Red Army had counterattacked, driving the Germans back from the capital, proving that the Blitzkrieg could be stopped. But this was not yet Soviet victory. This was the beginning of a long, grinding struggle that would consume millions of lives over 3 more years. The front line in early 1942 ran from Leningrad in the north, still besieged, through a bulge west of Moscow, down through Ukraine to the Black Sea. Along this line, millions of men faced each other in conditions of unimaginable brutality. Yang's division was sent to the Kharkov sector in eastern Ukraine, arriving in March 1942. The spring mud, the Rasputitsa that made movement nearly impossible, had temporarily frozen major operations. But the front was never quiet. Patrols, raids, artillery exchanges. Men died every day, even in what military reports called quiet sectors. Yang's first combat came on March 17, 1942, in a night raid on German trenches south of Kharkov. His battalion attacked before dawn, crossing half a mile of frozen ground under covering artillery fire, reaching the German trenches and fighting hand to hand with Wehrmacht infantry who were just as cold, just as exhausted, just as trapped by the war as the Soviets attacking them. Yang survived. Half his battalion did not. The raid accomplished nothing of strategic importance, captured a few prisoners, held the German trenches for 3 hours before a counterattack drove them back to their starting positions. This was the nature of the war in early 1942, small unit actions that achieved tactical objectives of no lasting significance while killing thousands. Yang learned quickly that survival in this environment required a combination of luck, constant vigilance, and a kind of fatalism. Men who worried too much about dying usually did. Men who stopped caring sometimes lived. The German soldiers Yang encountered in that first raid were not the Superman of propaganda. They were cold, hungry men like himself, wearing better uniforms perhaps, but just as exhausted by months on the Eastern Front. Yang had killed his first man in that trench, a Wehrmacht soldier no older than himself who had turned to face him in the darkness. The moment lasted seconds. Yang's bayonet, the other man's shouted warning that never finished. Then silence. Yang had felt nothing at the time. No triumph, no horror, just a mechanical need to keep moving, to survive the next minute. The feelings came later, in the dugout, when he had time to realize that he had ended a life, that the man he killed might have been conscripted too, might have had no more choice about being in that trench than Yang had about attacking it. This realization, this understanding that the men he was fighting were themselves trapped in systems beyond their control, would shape how Yang experienced the rest of the war. He was not fighting for communism. He barely understood what communism was beyond the political lectures the commissars delivered. Lectures about the dictatorship of the proletariat and the historical inevitability of socialist victory that meant nothing to a Korean farmer's son who just wanted to survive. He was not fighting for the Soviet Union, a country he had never chosen to enter. He was fighting because the alternative was death, because the Red Army shot deserters, because the only path forward was through the war. Through the spring of 1942, Yang's division held position south of Kharkov, rotating between frontline trenches and reserve areas a few miles back. The living conditions were primitive even by Soviet standards. Dugouts carved into the earth, reinforced with logs that leaked when it rained, that collapsed when they took direct artillery hits. Rations of black bread and thin soup, perhaps 400 calories a day, when supply was good, less when the supply lines were disrupted. No hot water. Lice in every uniform, crawling through the seams, biting constantly, spreading typhus that killed as many men as German bullets. Dysentery sweeping through units with predictable regularity, turning the latrines into places of misery where men waited in line even during artillery bombardments because the alternative was worse. Men were constantly sick, constantly exhausted, and yet still expected to fight when ordered to hold their positions, to attack when the commissars decreed that the moment had come to push the fascists back. Yang watched men die of diseases that would have been treatable with basic medical care, watched frostbite turn fingers and toes black, watched wounded soldiers beg for morphine that did not exist. The Red Army's medical services in early 1942 were overwhelmed, undersupplied, and operating under conditions that made effective treatment nearly impossible. A soldier wounded seriously enough to require evacuation had perhaps a 50% chance of surviving the journey to a field hospital. Those who made it to the hospital had perhaps a 50% chance of surviving the surgery if surgery was needed. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Yet men endured. Yang endured. The human capacity to adapt to horror, to normalize conditions that should be unbearable, was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Eastern Front. After a few weeks, the sound of artillery became background noise, noticed only when it stopped. The presence of corpses in no man's land, sometimes frozen in positions they had died in months earlier, became unremarkable. The possibility of death at any moment became a fact of existence, like weather, like hunger. You learned to sleep through bombardments if you were tired enough. You learned to eat your ration of bread, even if it was moldy, because refusing to eat meant weakness, and weakness meant death. The Korean soldiers in Yang's battalion formed a tight community within the larger division. They shared a language the Russians did not speak, a history the Russians did not understand. They helped each other, shared extra rations when someone was sick, covered for men who were too exhausted to function properly. The commissars watched them with suspicion, worried about ethnic solidarity that might translate into disloyalty to the Soviet state. But the Korean soldiers proved themselves in combat, held their positions, followed orders, and gradually earned a measure of trust from the Russian officers who commanded them. Yang became friends with a man named Kim Sung-ho, from a village 50 miles from Yang's home in Korea. Kim had escaped from a Japanese coal mine in northern Manchuria, had been caught by Soviet border guards in 1940, had spent a year in a labor camp before being released into the Red Army, when the German invasion made the Soviet Union desperate for men. Kim was 24, older than Yang, with a wife and infant son he had not seen since his conscription into the Japanese mines. He talked about them sometimes, late at night in the dugout when the shelling had stopped and men could not sleep. He wondered if they were still alive, if his wife had received any of the letters he had sent, if his son would remember him, if he somehow survived the war and made it home. These conversations, these moments of shared humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter, were what kept men sane. The knowledge that others felt the same fear, the same exhaustion, the same desperate homesickness, that you were not alone in your suffering. Yang and Kim made a pact, common among soldiers on the Eastern Front. If one died, the other would try to get word to the family. They exchanged information about their villages, their families, details that might help locate someone after the war, if after the war ever came. April passed into May. The division was brought up to strength with replacements. Young soldiers fresh from training camps in Siberia, boys who had never fired a rifle in combat, who would learn or die in their first engagement. Yang, at 23, with 2 months of frontline experience, was considered a veteran, expected to help train the new men, to teach them how to dig a proper fighting position, how to move under fire, how to identify the sound of different artillery pieces, and judge where the shells would land. Most of what Yang taught could be summarized simply. Keep your head down. Follow orders. Watch the veterans and do what they do. Hope you're lucky. The new soldiers were terrified, which was appropriate, and some of them were eager, which was dangerous. The eager ones got themselves killed quickly, volunteering for patrols, exposing themselves unnecessarily, believing that courage could deflect bullets. Yang and the other veterans tried to temper this enthusiasm, to teach them that survival required patience, caution, a willingness to be unheroic. Some learned. Others died before the lesson took hold. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In May 1942, the Red Army launched a major offensive aimed at recapturing Kharkov. The plan, designed by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko and approved by Stalin, called for a massive assault from 3 directions that would encircle and destroy the German forces holding the city. Yang's division participated in the northern thrust, attacking on May 12th as part of a force of 640,000 Soviet soldiers. The initial advance succeeded. Soviet forces broke through German lines, advanced 20 miles in 3 days, and Timoshenko reported to Moscow that Kharkov would fall within a week. But the Germans counterattacked. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group South, had anticipated a Soviet offensive and had positioned reserves for exactly this contingency. On May 17th, German panzer divisions struck the southern flank of the Soviet advance, cutting through the attacking forces, turning what had been an offensive into a pocket. Within 5 days, 3 Soviet armies were encircled. Within 10 days, 270,000 Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. The Second Battle of Kharkov, meant to demonstrate the Red Army's growing strength, became instead one of the worst Soviet defeats of the war. Yang's division found itself trapped in the pocket, cut off from supply, surrounded by German armor and infantry. The reality of encirclement became clear within hours. German artillery began systematically pounding Soviet positions. Stukas, the dive bombers whose sirens had terrorized European armies, screamed overhead, dropping bombs on any concentration of Soviet troops. Panzer units prowled the perimeter of the pocket, crushing attempts to break through with machine gun fire and high-explosive shells. The Soviet response was to attack. Not once, but repeatedly. Every day from May 23rd through May 30th, the trapped divisions launched assaults against German lines, trying to break out, to reach Soviet forces beyond the encirclement. These attacks were not carefully planned operations with adequate preparation. They were desperate charges by exhausted men with dwindling ammunition, ordered forward by commissars who threatened to shoot anyone who refused, who read Stalin's orders that forbade surrender under any circumstances. Yang participated in 3 of these breakout attempts. The first, on May 24th, began at dawn with artillery barrage from the division's remaining guns. Perhaps 20 howitzers, firing shells they could not replace, trying to suppress German positions long enough for infantry to cross the killing ground. Yang's company attacked across open farmland, wheat fields that should have been growing food, but were instead churned to mud by shells and tanks. They ran toward German machine gun positions 200 yards away, and the Germans waited until the Soviets were halfway across before opening fire. The MG-42, the German machine gun that fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, cut through the attacking Soviet infantry like a scythe through wheat. Men fell in rows. Yang hit the ground, crawled forward, fired his rifle at muzzle flashes he could barely see. The man beside him, a Ukrainian farmer whose name Yang had never learned, took a burst to the chest and died instantly. The attack lasted 20 minutes before the surviving Soviets retreated to their starting positions. Yang's company had begun the assault with 140 men. 83 made it back. The second attempt came the next day, May 25th. This time the attack went in at night, hoping darkness would reduce casualties. It didn't. German flares turned night into day. Searchlights mounted on armored vehicles swept across the battlefield, illuminating Soviet soldiers who became silhouettes for German gunners. Yang made it within 50 yards of German lines before machine gun fire forced him into a shell crater where he spent 4 hours listening to wounded men scream in the darkness, unable to help them, unable to retreat until the Germans stopped firing. By May 27th, the division had no artillery left, no tanks. Food was gone. Men were eating grass, roots, anything. The wounded were dying because there were no medical supplies, no morphine, no bandages, nothing but torn uniforms to press against bleeding wounds. The division's political officer, a commissar named Petrov, called the remaining officers together and told them that Stalin's order number 270 forbade surrender. Any man who allowed himself to be captured was a traitor to the motherland. Any officer who permitted his men to surrender would be shot if he survived. But Stalin was not in the pocket. Stalin was in Moscow, 1,000 miles away, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. The men in the pocket were starving, bleeding, dying. And on May 28th, German loudspeakers began broadcasting messages in Russian. "Surrender," the voices said. "You are surrounded. You cannot escape. Surrender, and you'll be fed. Surrender, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Surrender, and you will live." Some men believed these promises. Others knew better. They had heard stories of German treatment of Soviet prisoners, of mass executions, of starvation in camps, of conditions worse than combat. But they were also looking at their own situation, at men too weak to walk, at officers who had no ammunition to distribute, at a military organization that had ceased to function. Yang watched this calculation happening in real time, watched men deciding that the chance of survival as a prisoner was better than the certainty of death in the pocket. On May 30th, the commander of Yang's regiment, Colonel Andrei Volkov, made his decision. He gathered his remaining officers, perhaps 30 men out of the 300 the regiment had started the battle with, and told them simply, "We are out of ammunition. We are out of food. Most of our men can no longer fight. I will not order them to die for nothing. We will surrender." Commissar Petrov pulled his pistol and aimed it at Volkov, shouting that surrender was treason, that he would shoot Volkov himself. 3 junior officers disarmed Petrov and tied him to a tree. The regiment would surrender. White flags made from torn undershirts appeared along the Soviet lines. German soldiers approached cautiously, rifles ready, expecting tricks or traps. When they realized the surrender was genuine, they herded the Soviets into columns and marched them west, away from the pocket, toward collection points where tens of thousands of other captured Red Army soldiers were already gathering. Young walked in this column, hands raised, watching German soldiers who looked almost as exhausted as their prisoners, who handed out pieces of black bread to starving Soviet troops, who seemed neither particularly cruel nor particularly kind, just men doing their job of processing captured enemies. The German collection point was a field outside Kharkov, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers with machine guns. No barracks, no shelter, just open ground where captured Soviet soldiers sat or lay or wandered in a daze. German military police moved through the crowd, separating prisoners into categories. Political officers identified and taken away, most to be shot immediately under Hitler's Commissar order that mandated execution of Communist Party officials. Jews identified and removed. Men who looked healthy enough to work separated from those who looked near death. Young, emaciated but still able to walk, was processed as a laborer. His Korean features prompted questions from a German intelligence officer who spoke some Russian. Where was he from? How had he come to serve in the Red Army? Yang explained, Korean, conscripted by Japanese, escaped, joined Soviets. The German officer made notes, asked more questions, then stamped Yang's temporary identification card with a designation that translated roughly as Asiatic volunteer, non-Russian origin, suitable for labor deployment. The next 3 months were worse than combat. The Germans held hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners from the Kharkov offensive, far more than they had infrastructure to manage. The prisoners were given minimal food, perhaps 400 calories per day, barely enough to prevent immediate starvation, but not enough to maintain health. Dysentery spread through the camps. Typhus, tuberculosis. Men died by the thousands, and German policy was to let them die. Soviet prisoners, unlike Western Allied prisoners, were not protected by Geneva Convention compliance because the Soviet Union had not signed the convention. German authorities made a calculated decision that Soviet prisoners were expendable, that working them to death was acceptable policy. Yang survived because he was useful. German authorities discovered that some of the Korean prisoners spoke Japanese, and Japanese-speaking interpreters were valuable in 1942 as Germany and Japan coordinated their war efforts. Yang was transferred from the main prisoner camp to a smaller facility, where he worked as a translator for German officers communicating with Japanese military attachés. The work was easier than hard labor. The food slightly better. He was still a prisoner, still treated as subhuman by many of his captors, but he was alive when tens of thousands of other Kharkov prisoners were dead. By September 1942, German manpower needs had become acute. The Wehrmacht was fighting across a front line that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Caucasus Mountains, thousands of miles requiring millions of soldiers. German casualties were mounting. The battles at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus were consuming entire divisions. And Germany, unlike the Soviet Union, had a limited population base from which to draw replacements. Hitler's solution, implemented through a series of orders in late 1942, was to expand recruitment of Eastern volunteers, Soviet prisoners, and civilians who could be induced or forced to fight for Germany. These Ostruppen, as they were called, were organized into battalions officered by Germans, but composed largely of Soviet defectors, anti-communist Russians, Ukrainians who hated Stalin, Central Asians who saw German service as escape from Soviet prison camps. By 1943, over 1 million Soviet citizens were serving in German uniform in some capacity. Most were not combat troops. Most were labor units, support battalions, rear area security forces. But some were armed and sent to the front, and it was into these units that Korean prisoners like Yang were incorporated. The logic from the German perspective was simple. These men could not be sent back to Soviet territory. They would immediately defect or be shot as collaborators. They could not be kept in prison camps indefinitely that required guards and resources Germany needed elsewhere. But they could be given uniforms, minimal training, and sent to occupy France or Norway or the Balkans, freeing German soldiers for the Eastern Front. Whether these Ostruppen would actually fight if attacked was uncertain, but in rear areas, their mere presence provided security against partisans and resistance movements. Yang was offered this choice in October 1942 by a German officer who explained through a translator that remaining in the prison camp meant likely death from disease or starvation, while volunteering for labor service meant food, shelter, and survival. It was not framed as a choice to fight for Germany, not initially. It was framed as a choice between death and survival. Yang, like thousands of other prisoners, chose survival. He signed papers he could not read, was issued a German uniform, and was assigned to the 709th Infantry Division, a unit composed largely of Ostruppen under German command. The training was minimal, a few weeks learning basic German military commands, how to march in formation, how to handle a rifle. The German officers who supervised this training made no pretense that these soldiers were considered equals. They were called Highwiss, short for Hilfswillige, volunteer helpers, a designation that carried connotations of racial inferiority in Nazi ideology. They were paid less than German soldiers, fed less, given older weapons, and worn uniforms. They were constantly watched for signs of defection, and they were told repeatedly that if the Soviets recaptured them, they would be shot as traitors. This last point was not propaganda. Stalin had issued order number 270 in August 1941, stating that Soviet soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured were traitors, that their families would lose state support, that any who returned to Soviet territory would face military tribunals. The Soviet Union did not recognize the concept of honorable surrender. Capture meant collaboration in Soviet law, and collaboration meant death. Yang and the other Korean soldiers in German uniform knew this. They knew they could never go home, never return to Soviet territory, never surrender to the Red Army without facing execution. So they served, not out of loyalty to Germany, not out of belief in Nazi ideology, but because they were trapped between two totalitarian systems, both of which considered them expendable. Yang's division was sent to France in January 1943, assigned to coastal defense duties along the Atlantic Wall, the system of fortifications Hitler was building to prevent an Allied invasion. The posting was considered soft by Eastern Front standards. No immediate combat, adequate rations, relatively comfortable barracks in French towns. But it meant waiting for an invasion everyone knew was coming, serving in an army that did not trust them, preparing to fight against British and American forces who Yang had no particular reason to hate. Life on the Atlantic Wall through 1943 was a strange mixture of boredom and anxiety. The Germans were building massive fortifications, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, beach obstacles, transforming the French coast into a fortress. The Ostruppen units were used as labor, digging, carrying, building under the supervision of German engineers. They were also given guard duties, manning checkpoints, patrolling beaches, watching for signs of Allied reconnaissance. The work was tedious, but not particularly dangerous, and for men who had survived the Eastern Front or Soviet prison camps, this routine was almost pleasant. Yang's unit was stationed near Saint-Mire-Église, a small town in Normandy a few miles inland from Utah Beach. The town was quiet, its French civilians sullen but not actively hostile, its German garrison small and relatively relaxed. By spring of 1944, as rumors of Allied invasion preparations reached even the lowest ranks, Yang's battalion had been in France for 15 months. They had built fortifications, stood guard, occasionally dealt with French resistance activity that amounted to cut telegraph wires and stolen supplies. They had fired their weapons in training, but never at an enemy. Then came June. Intelligence reports filtering down from division headquarters warned that invasion was imminent. Allied bombing of French rail lines and bridges intensified. German units were moved into position along likely landing beaches. Leave was canceled. Ammunition was distributed. And on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, Yang Kyungjong heard aircraft overhead, hundreds of aircraft, the sound building until it drowned out everything else. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Allied Armada approaching Normandy included 13,000 aircraft, 5,000 ships, and 156,000 soldiers in the initial assault wave. The plan called for airborne troops to drop inland hours before the beach landings, to secure key objectives, to disrupt German communications, and prevent reinforcements from reaching the coast. Yang's position at Saint-Mire-Église was directly under the drop zone for the American 82nd Airborne Division. At 2 a.m. on June 6th, paratroopers began falling from the night sky. Yang watched from his bunker as parachutes opened, as tracers from German anti-aircraft guns cut upward into the darkness, as some planes exploded, as some parachutes caught fire, as some men landed in the town square, and were shot before they could free themselves from their harnesses. The confusion was total. American paratroopers were scattered across miles of countryside, most landing far from their intended drop zones, many landing in the swamps the Germans had deliberately flooded to hinder exactly this kind of assault. Yang's battalion commander, a German captain named Muller, ordered his troops to form a defensive perimeter around their headquarters building. But half the battalion was already gone, fled into the darkness, or surrendered at the first opportunity. The Ostruppen had not signed up to fight American paratroopers. They had expected garrison duty, not combat against elite airborne forces. Yang found himself in a small group of perhaps 20 soldiers, a mix of Koreans, Russians, and Ukrainians in German uniforms, commanded by one increasingly frantic German lieutenant who kept shouting orders no one fully understood. As dawn broke, American troops began systematically clearing the town. Yang heard firefights in nearby streets, heard German machine guns firing, heard the distinctive crack of American rifles, heard shouting in English. The lieutenant decided to surrender. He ordered his men to lay down their weapons, to raise their hands, to walk out into the street waving a white flag made from a bedsheet. Yang complied. He had no loyalty to Germany, no desire to die for Hitler's Reich in a French town whose name he could barely pronounce. The American paratroopers who captured Yang's group were from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Airborne. They were young, most barely 20 years old, pumped full of adrenaline from the jump and the combat, shocked to find themselves still alive after the chaos of the night drop. They herded the surrendering soldiers against a wall, rifles raised, shouting in English that none of the prisoners understood. Then one of the Americans, a sergeant, looked more closely at Yang and the other Koreans in the group. "Sir," the sergeant called to his lieutenant, "these guys ain't German. Look at them. They're Japs or Chinese or something." The American lieutenant approached, studied Yang's face, spoke slowly in English. "Who are you? Where are you from?" Yang did not understand the words, but recognized the question. He responded in the little Russian he knew, then tried Japanese, then a few words of German. The Americans looked at each other in confusion. One radioed for an intelligence officer. The prisoners were marched to a collection point where dozens of other captured German soldiers were sitting under guard. Over the next hours, as the battle for Normandy expanded, as thousands more Allied troops came ashore on the beaches, as German resistance stiffened and the outcome remained uncertain, Yang Qianzhong sat in a French field, hands bound, guarded by American soldiers who kept staring at him and his fellow Koreans, clearly trying to understand how Asian men had ended up fighting for Hitler in France. It would take days before Army intelligence officers could piece together their story, before translators could be found, before the full strange journey could be documented. Yang Qianzhong, who had been conscripted by the Japanese Empire in 1938, who had escaped to the Soviet Union in 1941, who had been captured by the Germans in 1942, who had been forced into Wehrmacht service in 1943, was now a prisoner of the United States of America in 1944. He had fought in 3 different uniforms for 3 different empires. He had crossed Asia and Europe. He had survived battles that killed millions. And he was 25 years old. The American intelligence officers who interviewed Yang Qianzhong in the days following his capture struggled to believe his story. It seemed impossible. A Korean man conscripted by Japan, escaped to the Soviets, captured by the Germans, now held by the Americans. Each step of the journey was documented in the papers Yang carried, in the successive identification cards issued by Japanese, Soviet, and German authorities, in the physical evidence of uniforms worn and discarded. But the totality seemed like fiction, like propaganda designed to discredit one side or another. Yet Yang's story was not unique. As American and British forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches in June and July of 1944, they captured more soldiers who did not fit the expected profile of Wehrmacht troops. More Koreans, yes, but also Tibetans, Mongolians, Central Asians from Soviet republics whose names Western intelligence officers had never heard. Men who spoke no German, who wore German uniforms, who had been found manning coastal defenses from Norway to the Spanish border. The Allies called them Volunteer Eastern Legions, the German designation. But volunteer was a word that described almost none of them. The historical records, incomplete as they are, suggest that approximately 5,000 Korean men served in German uniform by D-Day. Some, like Yang, have been captured while serving in the Soviet army. Others have been taken prisoner while serving in Japanese forces in Manchuria and China, have been handed over to the Germans under the Axis alliance, have been offered the same impossible choice between death in prison camps and service in German uniform. Still others have been Korean laborers in Soviet territory when the Germans invaded, have been captured in the Wehrmacht's advance, have been processed as prisoners and eventually incorporated into Osttruppen units. The exact number will never be known with certainty. German records of Osttruppen units were often incomplete, deliberately vague about the national composition of these formations because Nazi racial ideology had difficulty accommodating the reality that Germany was relying on racially inferior peoples to defend Hitler's European fortress. Soviet records, after the war, were silent about Soviet citizens who had served Germany, because acknowledging their existence meant acknowledging the complexity of loyalty under totalitarian systems, meant admitting that Stalin's armies had included men who later chose or were forced to fight for Hitler. What is certain is that on D-Day and in the weeks following, American, British, and Canadian forces encountered these men repeatedly. A British report from the 7th of June noted the capture of 6 prisoners of Mongolian appearance near Sword Beach who claimed to be Korean subjects of Japan forced into German service. A Canadian intelligence summary from June 15 documented multiple instances of Asian personnel in Wehrmacht uniform expressing desire to surrender at first contact with Allied forces. An American after-action report from the 29th Infantry Division described confusion when a bunker at Omaha Beach was found to contain 5 soldiers tentatively identified as Japanese or Korean who made no attempt to resist. These encounters created immediate practical problems. What should be done with prisoners who had technically fought for Germany but claimed to have been forced into service against their will? Were they prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections? Were they collaborators subject to war crimes prosecution? Were they stateless refugees who could be granted asylum? Different Allied commands made different decisions. The British generally classified them as POWs and sent them to camps in England. The Americans did the same initially, though some intelligence officers recommended their immediate release on grounds that they posed no security threat and had clearly been coerced. But releasing them raised another question. Released to where? Korea was still under Japanese occupation. Sending them back to Korea meant handing them to the Japanese, which seemed unjust given that Japanese conscription had started their ordeal. Sending them to the Soviet Union was impossible. Stalin had made clear his position on Soviet citizens who had been captured by the enemy. They were traitors, and their fate upon return would be execution or the Gulag. Keeping them in Allied prison camps indefinitely seemed cruel to men who had suffered enough. Yet there was no obvious alternative. Yang Kyungjong spent the remainder of 1944 in a prisoner of war camp in England, at a facility near Liverpool that housed captured German soldiers and the various nationalities found among them. The camp was not harsh by wartime standards. Prisoners received adequate food, shelter, medical care. They were allowed to write letters, though Yang had no one to write to. His family in Korea might be alive or dead. He had no way of knowing. His companions from the labor battalions were scattered across Asia, most probably dead. His fellow soldiers from the Red Army were either fighting still on the Eastern Front or had been killed or had become prisoners like himself. In the camp, Yang met other Korean soldiers with similar stories. Men who had been conscripted by Japan in 1939 or 1940, who had served in Manchuria or China, who had been captured by Soviet forces during border clashes, who had been pressed into Red Army service, who had then been captured by Germans during the Wehrmacht's advance into Soviet territory, who had finally ended up in German uniform on the Atlantic Wall. Each man's specific path varied, but the pattern was the same. Conscription, capture, conscription, capture, conscription, capture. 3 armies, none chosen, all endured. They spoke among themselves about what would happen when the war ended. Some hoped to return to Korea, assuming it would be liberated from Japan. But liberated by whom? The Americans? The Soviets? And what would a liberated Korea look like after 35 years of Japanese occupation? Others talked about staying in Europe, somehow finding work, building new lives in countries that had no connection to their past. A few spoke about emigrating to America, though none had any realistic plan for how this might be accomplished. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. Hitler's suicide in the Berlin bunker. The Soviet flag raised over the Reichstag. The final capitulation signed in a schoolhouse in Reims. For most prisoners, this meant repatriation, return to their home countries. German prisoners would eventually be released and sent back to Germany. Italian prisoners to Italy. But for the Koreans and other Asians found in German uniform, repatriation was complicated by the fact that the war in Asia continued. Japan had not surrendered. Korea remained occupied. The Allied authorities decided to hold them pending resolution of the Pacific War. Yang remained in the camp through the summer of 1945, listening to rumors of American advances across the Pacific, of Soviet entry into the war against Japan, of a new bomb of unprecedented power used against Japanese cities. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Korea, after 35 years, was free of Japanese rule. But Korea's freedom immediately became complicated by great power politics. The Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan on August 8th and had invaded Manchuria and northern Korea, now occupied the northern half of the peninsula above the 38th parallel. The United States occupied the southern half. The division was supposed to be temporary, an administrative convenience, while the Allies figured out Korea's future. It would become permanent, the border between North and South Korea, the line that would define Korean politics for the next 75 years. Yang and the other Koreans in Allied custody were given a choice in late 1945. They could return to Korea, either to the Soviet-occupied North or the American-occupied South, or they could remain in Europe as displaced persons, refugees without a country, dependent on Allied authorities for sustenance until some permanent solution could be found. Most chose to return. Korea was home, even after everything, even after 6 years away, even knowing that the country they returned to would be divided and uncertain. Yang chose to go south, to the American zone. His reasoning, expressed to an American interpreter, was simple. He had served in Soviet and German armies against his will. He did not want to live under Soviet occupation, did not trust that the Russians would distinguish between Koreans who had been forced to fight and those who had chosen collaboration. The American zone seemed safer, less likely to result in immediate arrest or execution. The journey home took 3 months. Yang and several hundred other Korean former prisoners traveled by ship from England to the Philippines, then to Japan, then finally to Pusan in southern Korea in December 1945. He arrived to find a country he barely recognized. The Japanese were gone, their colonial infrastructure collapsing, their administrators and police fled or arrested. American military government was trying to maintain order, but Korea after liberation was chaos. Millions of Koreans who had been forced to work in Japan or Manchuria were returning home. Political factions were forming, arguing about Korea's future. Communists backed by the Soviets. Nationalists backed by the Americans. Regional militias. Armed groups settling old scores from the occupation. Yang returned to his village in what was now North Pyongan Province, north of the 38th parallel, in Soviet-occupied territory. His parents were dead, died during the war years from illness. His younger brother had been killed serving in a Japanese unit in China. His sister had married and moved south. The farm was still there, but someone else was working it, claimed it had been abandoned. The local People's Committee, the communist-organized governing structure the Soviets were establishing, looked at Yang with suspicion. Where had he been for 6 years? In Japanese service, then Soviet, then German? This was suspicious. This required investigation. Yang stayed in his village for 2 weeks, realized he was under surveillance, realized that his service in the Red Army followed by capture by the Germans would be seen as betrayal in the emerging North Korean state. So he fled south, crossing the 38th parallel in January 1946, becoming one of hundreds of thousands of Koreans who moved south to escape Soviet occupation and the communist system being imposed in the north. In the American zone, Yang found work as a laborer in Pusan, loading and unloading ships at the port. He did not talk about his war experiences. He changed his name slightly to obscure his identity. He tried to disappear into the mass of refugees and displaced persons who were building new lives in southern Korea. When the Korean War broke out in June 1950, when North Korean forces invaded the South and the war he thought he had escaped returned to his homeland, Yang did not serve in any army. He was 31 years old. He had already fought enough. Yang Kyungjong's story survived because he was captured by Americans, because American intelligence officers documented his case, because his identification papers from 3 armies were preserved in military archives. His story became known in the West through a 2011 Korean film called My Way, which dramatized the experiences of Korean soldiers forced to fight for multiple powers. The film took liberties with the details, compressed timelines, invented characters. But the core truth remained. Thousands of Korean men had indeed been forced to serve in Japanese, Soviet, and German armies. Thousands had indeed survived this impossible journey. What happened to most of them remains unknown. The ones who returned to North Korea and stayed there left no records that have reached the outside world. The North Korean state, built on narratives of resistance to Japanese imperialism and loyalty to communist ideology, had no place for stories of men who had served in enemy armies, even under duress. These men either kept silent about their pasts or were purged as politically unreliable. The ones who came south and survived the Korean War mostly remained silent as well. South Korea in the 1950s and 60s was not interested in complicated stories of forced service. The national narrative emphasized resistance to Japan, not the reality that most Koreans had simply tried to survive occupation however they could. Only in recent decades, as Korea has become wealthy and democratic, as historians have begun examining the colonial period more honestly, have these stories begun to be told. Archives in Russia have been partially opened, revealing Soviet records of Korean soldiers in the Red Army. German archives have yielded fragments about Ostruppen units and their composition. Korean historians have interviewed the few survivors who lived long enough to tell their stories. Men now in their 90s or recently deceased, men who spent decades hiding their pasts. What emerges from these fragmentary records is a portrait of how empire and total war destroyed individual human agency. Yang Kyungjong and the thousands of men like him made almost no meaningful choices during the years from 1938 to 1945. They were conscripted by Japan because Japan needed labor and Korea was a colony to be exploited. They were captured by Soviets or escaped to Soviet territory and were pressed into Red Army service because the Soviet Union was desperate for manpower and did not trust colonial subjects to remain neutral. They were captured by Germans and forced into Wehrmacht service because Germany was equally desperate and saw these prisoners as expendable labor for garrison duties. At each stage, the choice was between compliance and death. Men who refused Japanese conscription were imprisoned or killed, and their families were punished. Men who refused Soviet service after escaping Japanese control were sent to gulags. Men who refused German service after being captured by the Wehrmacht were left to starve in prison camps. These were not free choices. These were the options available to powerless men trapped between empires. The moral complexity of their situation challenges simple narratives about collaboration and resistance. Were these men collaborators because they served in German uniform? The standard answer from Allied authorities at the war's end was yes. Service to the enemy was collaboration regardless of circumstances. But this answer erased the context, treated men who had been forcibly conscripted 3 times as equivalent to men who had volunteered for ideological reasons. It ignored the fundamental difference between choice and coercion. The Soviet Union's treatment of returned prisoners illustrated this moral absolutism. Stalin's Order No. 270 declared that any Soviet soldier captured by the enemy was a traitor. When millions of Soviet prisoners returned from German captivity after the war, They were not welcomed as survivors, but investigated as suspected collaborators. Hundreds of thousands were sent directly from German camps to Soviet gulags. The Soviet state made no distinction between men who had actively collaborated with the Germans and men who had simply survived as prisoners. All were guilty of the crime of capture. For the Koreans who had served in Soviet uniform before being captured, this meant that return to Soviet-controlled territory was effectively a death sentence. They could not go back to Soviet Central Asia, where some had been living before conscription. They could not go to Northern Korea once it fell under Soviet occupation and then communist rule. Their service, forced as it was, had marked them permanently. The broader historical significance of these Korean soldiers lies in what their experience reveals about total war. The Second World War mobilized entire societies, conscripted entire populations, turned millions of civilians into combatants whether they wished it or not. The war was fought not just by professional soldiers or volunteers, but by masses of conscripts who had little choice in the matter. Most of these conscripts served only one army, fought for only one side. But men on the margins of empires, men from colonies and occupied territories, men caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, sometimes found themselves forced to serve multiple sides, their bodies used as instruments of states they had no loyalty to. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was particularly brutal in this regard. The German-Soviet conflict was a war of annihilation, fought with unprecedented ruthlessness, governed by ideologies that saw enemy populations as subhuman and expendable. Both sides conscripted millions. Both sides treated prisoners with contempt. Both sides used foreign nationals in their armies when it suited their purposes, then abandoned or executed these same people when they became inconvenient. The Koreans in Wehrmacht uniform were far from the only example. Germans used Russian, Ukrainian, Cossack, Turkic, and Caucasian troops in various capacities. Soviets used Germans, Romanians, Finns, and other nationals captured in battle. What made the Korean soldier situation unique was the distance they traveled, both geographically and through the military hierarchies of different empires. From Korea to Manchuria to the Soviet Far East to Ukraine to France represents thousands of miles, multiple theaters of war, a journey that crossed the entire breadth of the Eurasian landmass. To survive such a journey required extraordinary luck, adaptability, and perhaps a kind of fatalism that allowed men to accept that they had no control over their fates, that survival meant accepting whatever uniform was forced upon them. The question of how these men understood their own experience, what they thought about the ideologies they were supposedly serving, remains largely unanswered. Few left written records. The interviews conducted decades later reveal mostly pragmatic concerns. They were trying to survive. They were trying to avoid starvation. They were trying to get home. Political ideology, whether Japanese imperialism or Soviet communism or Nazi fascism, mattered less than immediate questions of food, shelter, and safety. This pragmatism frustrates historians who want clear moral categories, who want to classify people as resistors or collaborators, as heroes or villains. But the experience of these Korean soldiers suggests that most people in wartime are neither. Most people are trying to survive. Most people make calculations based on immediate threats and limited information. Most people, given the choice between dying for a principle and living by compromising, choose to live. This does not make them heroes, but does not necessarily make them villains either. The legacy of these soldiers in Korean memory remains contested. In South Korea, their story is sometimes told as an example of Korean suffering under Japanese imperialism, the beginning point of their ordeal. Films and books emphasize that their service in Soviet and German armies was forced, that they were victims of circumstance. In North Korea, the story is largely suppressed because it complicates the official narrative of resistance to imperialism and loyalty to communism. Men who served in enemy armies, even under duress, do not fit easily into the mythology of revolutionary struggle. For historians studying the Second World War, these soldiers represent a reminder of how total war affects ordinary people. The great battles, the strategic decisions, the movements of armies across maps. These are what military history traditionally focuses on. But beneath these large movements were millions of individual stories of people swept up by forces beyond their control. Yang Kyungjong's journey from Korean village to Japanese labor battalion to Soviet army to German prison camp to Wehrmacht service to American captivity to return home tells us something important about what it meant to be a colonial. It meant having no country that would protect you. It meant being subject to conscription by any power that controlled the territory you happened to be standing on. It meant that your body was a resource to be used by states you had no connection to. It meant that survival required constant adaptation, constant submission, constant willingness to put on whatever uniform would keep you alive one more day. And it meant that even after surviving, even after the war ended, there was no simple return to normal life. No easy way to explain what you had endured to people who had not experienced it. Yang Kyungjong lived until 1992, dying at the age of 73 in a suburb of Busan. He had spent the last 46 years of his life as a civilian, working various jobs, raising a family, never speaking publicly about his war experiences until very late in life when a Korean historian tracked him down and convinced him to share his story. The historian Shin Hyung-ki spent months interviewing Yang, corroborating his account with archival records, eventually publishing a paper that brought Yang's story to wider attention. In the interview, conducted in 1991, Yang was asked how he felt about his service in 3 different armies. His answer, according to Shin's notes, was remarkably free of bitterness. "I was young," Yang said. "I did not understand politics. I did not choose to fight. I chose only to live. I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm not ashamed either. I survived. That is enough." This statement captures something essential about the experience of millions of ordinary people in the Second World War. They did not choose the war. They did not choose their roles in it. They simply endured it, made the choices available to them, survived if they were lucky. To judge them by peacetime standards of moral choice is to misunderstand what it meant to live through total war as a powerless person. The war was not about their choices. It was something that happened to them, something they had to navigate as best they could. The 5,000 Korean soldiers who fought in German uniforms on D-Day were not heroes of resistance. But neither were they willing collaborators with evil. They were men caught between empires, forced to serve whichever army controlled them at any given moment, trying simply to live through the catastrophe of the 20th century's most destructive conflict. Their story is not one of glory or honor. It is a story of survival, of adaptation, of the terrible choices people must make when every option is bad, and the only question is which option might allow you to see another day. When American paratroopers captured Yang Kyungjong on the morning of June 6, 1944, they were looking at the face of total war's victims. Not German soldiers defending Hitler's Reich, but a Korean man who had spent 6 years being passed from one army to another, who had crossed a continent and an ocean, who had survived battles he had no stake in, who wanted nothing more than to go home. The Americans, to their credit, eventually understood this. They did not prosecute Yang as an enemy combatant. They classified him as what he was, a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a man who deserved a chance to return home and rebuild a life. That so many men like Yang existed, that thousands of Koreans and other colonial subjects were forced into similar journeys, tells us something important about the Second World War that is often lost in the focus on strategy and battles and great leaders. It tells us that the war was not just a conflict between armies and ideologies. It was a catastrophe that engulfed ordinary people, that destroyed their lives and communities, that forced them into roles they never chose, that gave them impossible choices, and then judged them for how they navigated those choices. Yang Kyungjong's story, and the stories of the thousands of men like him, deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or an anomaly, but as an illustration of what total war means for people without power. It means that your life is not your own. It means that your body becomes an instrument of states you have no loyalty to. It means that survival requires you to compromise, to adapt, to accept situations that would be intolerable in peacetime. And it means that even if you survive, even if you make it home, The experience marks you forever, shapes the rest of your life in ways you cannot fully escape. The Korean soldiers in German uniforms on D-Day were not fighting for Germany. They were not fighting for any ideology. They were simply trying to survive one more day of a war they had never chosen to fight. And in that, they were like millions of other ordinary people caught in the machinery of the Second World War. People whose stories are less dramatic than the great battles, but perhaps more revealing of what the war actually meant for most of humanity. Not glory, not heroism, not even clear moral choices. Just survival, endurance, and the hope that somehow, eventually, it would end and they could go home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.